Welcome to the Western Ohio PBIS Network podcast. My name is Brandy Stiegel. You're watching video 7 of the 7-part video series that is focusing on helping your Tier 2 PBIS team implement those supports and systems that are needed for your students that are in need of Tier 2 interventions. After this video, you will be able to describe the students who are most likely to benefit from the self-monitoring intervention. You will understand the research associated with self-monitoring. You will understand the components of the self-monitoring intervention. You will be able to understand how to design and implement self-monitoring as a Tier 2 intervention. You will understand how to deliver implementation training according to the audience needs. You will understand how student data should be collected and graphed. You will understand how to monitor progress and make decisions for the students who are participating in this intervention. You understand how to create a process for fading interventions, and you will understand the criteria for exiting the intervention, as well as some adaptations you can make to support other interventions. So, self monitoring is the practice of observing and recording one's own actions and behavior. Again, it is designed to teach students to change or maintain their own behavior. It's designed to help students move towards that self regulation that is needed for them to be successful in school. Self-monitoring rather falls under this broad umbrella of self-management. So some skills that students need in order to self-manage would be self-monitoring, meaning they can observe and record their own actions and behaviors. Um, self-manage Self-management requires goal setting, which means that they can create a behavior target that they want to accomplish or reach. Self instruction means that the use of self talk or statements is used to direct their behavior. Self evaluation means that that student is able to assess their target behavior against a set standard and evaluate their progress. And then strategy instruction means that that student is able to follow a series of steps that they need to complete a task autonomously. So they're able to work independently and follow a series of steps to accomplish a goal. So let's talk a little bit about an overview of self-monitoring. In order for students to self-monitor, that student must have that skill they are being asked to self-monitor in their repertoire, meaning they have to have been explicitly taught that skill in order to be able to self-monitor and monitor themselves as to whether or not they are demonstrating that skill. That participant must be able to um, recognize the occurrence of that skill. So they must be able to recognize when they are or are not doing that skill. The purpose of self monitoring is to increase the frequency of a desired behavior or skill, as well as to ensure the accurate completion of that task or that skill. So self-monitoring is a behavior that is going to force that student to focus on and be aware of those desired outcomes. That awareness of those desired outcomes and demonstrating those desired behaviors has been shown to increase the occurrence of that desired behavior. So when students know what they're looking for, what behaviors they should be doing, and they're monitoring to see if if they are actually doing those behaviors, they're more likely to continue doing those behaviors. So there's a connection with increasing the likelihood that those behaviors will continue to occur through using self-monitoring. The good thing about self-monitoring that it is a very flexible intervention, and it may be applied to a wide range of skills. And it has been found to work with students of all ages, regardless of their academic ability or any type of ability. This intervention really works with students of all age ranges and with all academic abilities. So there are some benefits of using self-monitoring as an intervention. So the first thing is self-monitoring has been used effectively to improve both academic and behavioral skills. We all know that when students, again, are active participants in their learning process. They're going to be more engaged. Self-monitoring is best used with students who have whose function of behavior is to escape. Self-monitoring can be used and matched to other functions if that reinforcement for attaining a goal is manipulated. Self-monitoring can be effective, as I said earlier, for a wide range of ages, disabilities, and skills. So this intervention can be adapted for a variety of students. Self-monitoring is going to contribute to students acquiring those skills of self-regulation, which is a skill that is a crossover skill between academics and behaviors, meaning you need self-regulation to be successful in your academics as well as in behavior. Many people like self-monitoring as an intervention because self-monitoring is viewed as less invasive than other teacher managed or teacher directed strategies because the locus of control is with the student. So it's going to require less teacher time and less adult attention. So, as we said, self monitoring is going to help students develop those self regulation skills, which are needed to be successful in academics as well as behavior. So, self monitoring is going to contribute to that acquisition of those self regulation skills. Research has found that self-regulated learners are more likely to be motivated. They're more likely to value personal progress. Self-regulated students are more willing to attempt difficult tasks, to develop new skills, as well as those that are self-regulated view mistakes as a chance and an opportunity to learn. They view those as a learning opportunity. The learners who are able to self-monitor have control over their learning process and they're engaged in evaluating their work. If students are able to develop the ability to self-monitor successfully, this practice can be applied to other behaviors and academic skills, which is going to allow that student to become more independent and move towards that self-regulation. So let's look at an overview of the intervention, the self-monitoring intervention. Of course, the first step is to identify that target behavior. The next step is to define the target behavior. Then the team is going to collect baseline data. They're going to then design procedures and materials to implement that self-monitoring intervention. They'll then teach those students how to self-monitor and then monitor their progress towards implementing and using this intervention. And then as they see that that student is progressing and having a positive response to the intervention, then they will determine how they will follow up and begin to fade that intervention. So let's go over these steps one by one. So the first step, as I said, is to identify that target behavior. So that tier 2 team is going to identify the problem behavior. And again, prior to the student being enrolled into tier 2 intervention, that tier 2 team has done some problem solving. They are identifying the behaviors that the student is experiencing that is warranting them to need tier 2 intervention. They are walking through that process, that FACTS process, to determine the function of the behavior. They're ensuring that they are matching these students to the proper intervention based on that function of the behavior. So after the team has to identify the problem behavior, the tier 2 team is going to determine a replacement behavior that should be aligned to those school-wide tier 1 expectations. That replacement behavior should always be stated in positive terms. That team is going to consider, as they are talking about the problem behavior, where does that behavior occur? Where are we most likely seeing the student exhibiting that problem behavior? And again, we're always going to want to know the function of that behavior. Is it to gain attention from adults or peers, or is it to escape? So again, that fact finding process is very important to understand what the function of that behavior. So after that team has identified the problem behavior and the replacement behavior, the next step is that team is going to define that target behavior. So always, again, just like with all rules and everything in PBIS, the replacement behavior should be defined so that it's observable, measurable, positively stated, understandable, and always applicable. It should follow that PUA guidelines. The parameters of that expected performance of the behavior should be clearly communicated with examples and non-examples discussed. So we should know exactly what the demonstration of that behavior looks like and what it doesn't look like. If there are steps associated with the behavior or skills, these should be listed, and it should be practiced, taught explicitly, and giving those students that opportunity to practice those steps. In order for a student to self-monitor a skill, they must have had explicit instruction, and it must have been something that they have mastered, and it must be a skill in that student's repertoire. So some examples of target behavior: respect others. So in this case, we've defined it explicitly, which means use good words, keep hands and feet to yourself, ask to use others' belongings. An example of be responsible, or a target behavior being responsible. We've defined that as go to class on time, bring needed materials, and put your things away when done. Again, we are giving the students the exact steps and skills that they need for that target behavior. Another example is follow directions. This means listen to what you are being asked to do, ask questions. So when we're thinking about those target behaviors, they need to follow that AMPUA. They need to be observable, measurable, positively stated, understandable, and always applicable. So after that team has defined that target behavior, the next thing they're going to do is begin to collect and graph that baseline data. And again, we've talked about this in several videos about that process of working with the student's teachers and those adults that interact with that student to collect that data to get an idea of where we're starting at and to help us monitor that progress. So baseline data is collected so that it may be compared to the performance of that target behavior after that intervention has been implemented. So we get some data to start so that as we are collecting data on that student's response to the intervention, we're able to monitor their progress. Again, just like with all of the other interventions that we've discussed in this series, it's going to be important to graph that baseline data using those trend lines, those goal lines, and those data points to identify that student's progress. Several things with this type of graphing. We may be with graphing, we want to collect frequency counts, which means we're going to be recording each time that student demonstrates that particular behavior. In this case, we're also going to be recording time sampling, meaning that we want to have the occurrence or the non-occurrence of that target behavior during a fixed specific amount of time. So we want to make sure that in that baseline graph data that we get at least 3 to 5 data points to help us generate that graph and that baseline data. So the next step is to design procedures and materials for the self-monitoring intervention. So some procedural things to consider is, first of all, the intervention procedure should include where and when that student is going to be doing this self-monitoring. So in what circumstances and in what environments are we going to be expecting that student to do that self-monitoring? Will the other consideration is, will that student only self-monitor during the most problematic times of the day, or are they going to be self-monitoring for the entire day? And so that's, again, something that as that team is problem solving and going through that fact-finding process to determine the student's needs, that they're going to think about. How are we going to prompt or remind the students to record their use of their skills? So how are we going to prompt them to complete those progress reports and monitor those skills that we're asking them to? What type of queuing systems are going to be created for students that are requiring frequent monitoring? So how are we going to, what cues are we going to put in to let them know when they need to be demonstrating them skills? So behaviors such as staying on task, those behaviors are going to need frequent monitoring. So you're definitely going to need a queuing system for any skills that require frequent monitoring. They're going to be need to queue to implement or demonstrate those skills. And then you need to think about What other behaviors are we going to record? So other behaviors may only need to be recorded at the end of a class period, such as the use of those social skills or whatnot. So what other behaviors are we going to have them monitor throughout that self-monitoring time frame? So some materials that need to be considered would be how you're going to track the student self-monitoring and what are the acknowledgments that you're going to use to reinforce those behaviors. Again, this is a intervention that will be tracked using a daily progress report. So that daily progress report should specifically list those target behaviors, um, with any steps associated. It should have space for the student to record their performance of that skill, a place to record the daily total points that they received, and as well as a space to record that what the goal is for the day. So there should be a code or a number should be agreed upon to indicate if that skill was performed accurately. There may be some cases where there could just be a yes or no. So if it's a question like, is the student on task? That's a yes or no, or it may be a rating scale where 3, 2, 1, 3 meaning that the student demonstrated it, 1 meaning somewhat, or 0 meaning not at all. Whatever that rating is, there needs to be a rating that has been developed for a rating scale for that, and that should be explained on the progress report. And again, just like with every intervention, there should be goals set for that the number of daily points that student wants to get. It should be challenging as always, but yet attainable for that student. So here are some examples of progress reports. As you see in this case, of course, we always have where the student's name and the date. We have an explanation of the ratings. We have the time frame that we are monitoring. We have the skills across the top, which in this case is be safe. We have the school wide. Again, we're connecting this to the school wide expectation. So in this case, be safe. And this student is tracking their and monitoring their ability to keep their hands and feet to themselves. They have their rating. And then along this side, they have the teacher check. And then we have the other be respectful, follow directions, use appropriate material. So again, we have a space for the teacher to record their observations. Then we have the place to total up the number of points, and again, a place for parents to sign and give feedback. So here is an example of a person that or a student that would be in multiple bell periods and has multiple teachers, probably in high school or middle school. And again, same thing. We have the student's name, the description of the points, and the skills that we are working to have them self-monitor. So after we have created the procedures and obtained all the materials necessary, the next thing is going to be teaching students how to self-monitor. So this is an intervention that students, first of all, in order to monitor a skill, they have to have that skill in their repertoire, and they need to be explicitly taught about this concept of self-monitoring. So students must be able to review and recognize that target behavior. So again, that's why we're going to require that explicit instruction in that particular skills. Progress towards accurately completing that daily progress report should be monitored until that student is completing it accurately at least 80% of the time for a week. So we want to make sure that the student understands how to complete their self-monitoring report, because again, that data is going to be that is going to be the data that we're using to track their response to this intervention. So once the student is completing that daily progress report accurately for at least 80% of the time, we're going to begin to evade the adult checks. Before that, we're checking in with the student to make those teachers are checking in with the student to make sure that those progress reports are being completed accurately. As we see that they are going and completing the checks, the monitoring and the daily progress reports accurately, we're going to begin fading those adult checks to maybe down to once a week, where we're checking in to make sure they are completing those reports. And again, throughout this time, we want to continuously have these conversations with students about their target behavior and what those target behaviors are. We want to, when we're teaching students about self-monitoring, role playing is going to be very helpful. It's very important to discuss non-examples as well as examples of those target behaviors. We're going to be teaching students how to complete that daily progress report and making sure they understand how to complete it accurately. And again, with this intervention, progress towards accurately completing that daily progress report should be monitored each time until that student is completing that progress report with an 80% accuracy. Again, we're always continuously giving that specific positive feedback when they are accurately completing that report. Um, and lastly, that adult interaction and involvement, as well as that target behavior, should begin to be being faded as we see students starting to use the skill of self-monitoring. So those reinforcements and that adult interaction and that feedback can be faded as we begin to see the students exhibiting those skills. And we want to help them move that to self-regulation, which means they need less prompting to do it. So as we said, with teaching students to self-monitor, we always want to teach them examples and non-examples of those target behaviors. We want to explain why that behavior is important. We want to help the students determine when and where that student will monitor that behavior, and what we're going to use to complete that DPR. And then we always want to set a goal, and we want to always get the students' feedback on this process. We want to make sure that they have some input on this process. So the next step is, of course, to monitor progress. Whatever intervention that we put in place, we always want to make sure that we are monitoring progress towards that in that intervention and in acquiring those skills that we're working on. So positive feedback is given for students accurately assessing and recording their progress, of course, until that student reaches that completing that DPR accurately 80% of the time. So we're using that specific positive feedback to help increase the likelihood that they are going to demonstrate those skills that we are looking for. As after they've reached that 80% of the time, again, that teacher check is going to be faded to that one time per week where we're checking in and making sure that they are using that. And again, each student's DPR should be converted to a percentage and charted on a graph, just like our other interventions. We know those basic graphing conventions means we need a goal line, we need a vertical line between the baseline and the intervention data line to indicate the phase and when that intervention was began. We need that trend line to track their progress towards their goals. Then that data is going to be used to make decisions on whether to continue that intervention, make changes to that intervention because the student is having a questionable or a poor response to that intervention, or whether they are going to begin fading that process. So again, it's very important that students understand how to complete that daily progress report so that we can get good data and understand how they are responding to the intervention. So as students hopefully are responding and having a positive response, and once those students have been having a positive response and our data indicates that they are having that positive response over a specific period of time, the next step is going to be to think about how we're going to follow up and fade that intervention. So during this process, we are going to constantly be reteaching and reviewing skills as necessary. We're going to constantly review their progress with them and have those student conferences and celebrate the successes that they're having. When we see that a student is consistently using a skill and attaining a goal, we're going to reduce them again the amount of times per week that that student is required to monitor themselves. So we're going to begin in fading the amount of times that they have to complete that daily progress report. But we're going to again continue to have a periodic adult checks for maintenance to make sure that they are still continuing to use those skills. Um, Once that student has successfully met his or her goals for a period of time and have reached that criteria that tier 2 team has set for success, then we're going to begin fading them from this intervention and reducing the amount of supports that we have. And again, we're not going to do this cold turkey. We're going to do this incrementally so that we make sure that the students are still able to maintain the skills that they are getting. So when we are doing this fading, students who are fading are going to still be monitored to make sure that that student is maintaining that performance of that targeted behavior. So just like with all of the other interventions, there are several core people that are needed to implement this intervention. There is an intervention coordinator as well as those teachers that are going to be working with the students. So the role of the intervention coordinator is the coordinator is going to organize materials and help orient the student to the intervention. The coordinator is going to be the person responsible for notifying the parents of the students involved about the intervention, and they're going to support the teachers in their implementation of the intervention. So that coordinator is going to support those teachers that have to do the intervention. The coordinator is going to communicate with that tier 2 team regarding how many students are involved in the intervention and their progress, how those students are progressing and responding to that intervention. And the coordinator is also going to be the person to track that student data. Now, of course, we need the teachers because this intervention is happening in that classroom, in their the students' natural environments. So the teachers who have students in this intervention are going to be expected to help train that student in completion of that daily progress report. They're going to be responsible for checking the students' completion of that progress report until that student is successfully completing that progress report independently at least 80% of the time. So that teacher is going to be the person that's going to facilitate the completion of these daily progress reports. The teacher is going to be the person to collect these daily progress reports and turn those reports into the coordinator, the intervention coordinator, at least weekly. So that team's going to figure out how that teacher is going to collect those reports and submit them to that intervention. And then the teacher is also going to be responsible for conferencing with the student and discussing their data on a regular basis and having those student conferences so that student can help track their progress towards their goals. So, when we think about what are the steps for effective implementation of the self-monitoring intervention, the first thing that team is going to have to do is identify a coordinator and train them about the self-monitoring intervention and their roles. The next thing is they're going to have to identify those eligible students by using that data collection process that team has gathered. And identifying the function of the behaviors and if self-monitoring is an appropriate intervention for a particular behavior. The next thing, of course, is we always have to notify the parents that their child would be participating in this intervention and help them understand their role in supporting this intervention. And then we're going to go back and follow those 7 steps that we just discussed in implementing the intervention. So, as with all intervention, staff, parents, family, all persons involved need to be trained. And again, the amount of training that a person is going to need is going to correspond with their role in the implementation. So, for all staff training should consist of practicing how to monitor students as they complete their chart and appropriate ways to give that specific positive feedback when they're accurately um, completing that chart or they're demonstrating a skill. As well, those teachers need to understand, or those staff need to understand the corrective feedback and how they can use that corrective feedback if a student is exhibiting or demonstrating behavioral errors. We need to train staff in understanding the importance of frequent checks and feedback as the student begins that intervention and when and how they should fade that feedback once that student has acquired those skills. Um, in terms of student training, we need to train students how to use that daily progress report, how to monitor their skills. Again, before we even put them in a self-monitoring intervention, we need to ensure that they have been explicitly taught those skills. So students must be oriented to the intervention and clearly taught how to carry out their responsibilities and understand their roles. Now, when it comes to families, families will also need some sort of training. Families will need to be trained on what skills that their student or their child is being asked to monitor. They need to understand the daily progress report and how that report is going to be used to monitor their child's performance. And they need to understand how they're going to receive data about their child's performance and their progress. So everyone is going to need some level of training, and that tier 2 team is going to need to think about how they're going to train those parents, those staff members, and those students that are involved in this intervention. So as we said, and we talked about in earlier videos, self-monitoring can be used as a modification to other interventions such as check in and check out. So when we're thinking about check in and check out as self monitoring as a modification for check in and check out, of course, self monitoring can be used as a support for check in and check out. It can be used as a student is having positive responses to the intervention, whatever intervention, check in, check out, social skills intervention groups, to begin feeding those students as they are having a positive response. So in order to use this as a variation or a modification to check in and check out, that student again has to have this explicit instruction around self-monitoring. So before a coordinator begins or a facilitator begins to fade these interventions, the check-in and check-out intervention or the social skills intervention, of course, the student has to have that explicit instruction around self-monitoring. They can still use the same check in, check out daily progress report that they use. It's just now we're going to add those self monitoring components to that check in and check out. So now we're going to talk about self-monitoring as a fading procedure. So as I just said, a lot of our other interventions, self-monitoring is a helpful intervention to use as we're going to begin fading those students from some of the other interventions, such as social skills intervention groups or check-in and check-out. So self-monitoring is a good transition from that teacher-led intervention, such as check-in, check-out, social skills intervention groups, or whatever, to students having that autonomy to regulate their own behavior. So when we are looking at this, students are going to be slowly transition from having that teacher complete a chart and that teacher complete those daily progress reports to those students completing it independently and doing it themselves and monitoring themselves. Those teachers are still going to provide those periodic checks at random intervals to make sure that that student is accurately performing and recording their performance and maintaining those target behaviors and skills. So again, fading means we are slowly and incrementally removing those interventions and supports so that students can begin to self-regulate. So, of course, with any intervention, we need to continue with the ongoing monitoring of the intervention. We're going to be looking at the fidelity of the intervention and how well the intervention is being implemented. We're, of course, going to always look at the social validity of the intervention, and we're going to continue monitoring those intervention outcomes. So, with that fidelity of the intervention, we want to look at all of those persons responsible for implementing the intervention, making sure they're implementing with fidelity so that we can ensure that the students' responses are due to what those responses are due to. So, if the person is not implementing that intervention with fidelity, the data can't be accurate. So some things we can do is look at that daily progress report to determine if it was completed using those designated time intervals. So we're making sure that that student understands how to complete that report. Determining if that teacher observed the student completing that chart and have they been monitoring and checking for accuracy. So we're looking to see that the teacher is facilitating and supporting that completion of that report. Teachers or student adults may need to observe the student self-monitoring to determine if they are completing their reports and self-monitoring at the appropriate schedule that the team has been set. And it may be necessary for that person that is looking at the fidelity to interview the teacher and the student to determine if there are any problems that may be associated with the implementation. So we're going to be really digging deep and unpacking what's happening in the intervention. And in this case, because it's self-monitoring, that fidelity is going to require checking that the teacher is adhering to their responsibilities and that the student is adhering to their responsibilities and understands their responsibilities and how to accurately complete those daily progress reports, because those are going to be the primary way that we're going to be checking student progress. So, of course, we want to know the social validity of the intervention. So that means that we're determining whether the goals, the intervention elements, and those anticipated outcomes are acceptable, socially relevant, and useful to the individual and to those who care about the individuals. We want to make sure what we're doing is having an impact and it's culturally relevant and our practices are culturally responsible. So, of course, we can collect that social validity using things such as interviews or rating scale questionnaires. You can create your own rating scale, or there are some interventions that may have included their own rating scales. But again, we're just going to use some type of survey or interview or questionnaire to get feedback from those participants and those stakeholders on how clear and easy the intervention was to implement, and if the results were worth the effort or made intended improvements in the student's behavior. So we always want to get that social validity data to understand if this is an appropriate intervention. So again, we always want to monitor the intervention outcomes to make sure that the students are being successful with this intervention. We don't want to continue an intervention that a student is not benefiting from. So, of course, we always want to understand that students' response to the intervention. So, we're going to be using those daily progress reports to collect and graph data to understand how those students are moving towards that goal that Tier 2 team set. We always want to know the number of students who are participating in that intervention and how many students are having a positive, a questionable, or a poor response to that intervention. We want to know the number of students that have had a positive outcome from this intervention and graduated from this intervention. We always want to review that student outcome data to see if this intervention is having an impact on the student. Thank you for tuning into this video. Please don't forget to hit like or subscribe.